everyone. Welcome to our 2019 PSAT webinar. This is sort of a review for those of you who took the test in October. My name is Sarah, and I am a tutor and test prep instructor at the Boca location for Score at the Top. Hopefully everybody can hear me. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand, send a message, and I will hopefully get to those. So we'll start out today just talking about the general structure of the PSAT. So I'll pull that up now. Okay. Let's see. Best way to do this. Okay, this should be good. Okay, so this is the structure of the PSAT. Those of you who took it in October know what the tests look like, but just to be familiar with it, your first section will be a reading section for 60 minutes. It will have 4 passages and 1 pair of passages. It will have 47 questions. You will have a break, and then you will have the writing and language section next for 35 minutes. That's 4 passages containing 44 questions. Then you will have the math with no calculator section for 25 minutes. You will have 13 multiple choice questions and 4 grid-ins. Grid-ins are like free response because you have no answer choices to choose from, and it's almost impossible to guess. So on questions like grid-ins, I definitely recommend doing the grid-ins first and then doing the multiple choice, because if you run out of time, you can always guess on the multiple choice. So you'll have a break after that section. You will have your last section, which is the math with calculator section, and that's 45 minutes for 27 multiple choice questions and 4 grid-ins. Okay, so scoring. This is the scoring showing the difference between the PSAT and the SAT. PSAT has lower scores overall. That way they will reflect sort of how you would do on the SAT. Yes. Okay, so generally for the sections, you will have 1 evidence-based reading and writing section score and another math score. So there are 2 subsection scores that combine to get a total score. So this is just an example of how it breaks down. What's really important are these 2 sections. You'll see me skip through a lot here. Don't worry, I'm making sure to hit the points that are most important. So one super important thing to know is that there's no penalty for wrong answers on this test. So you want to make sure no matter what, even on the grid-ins, you will guess something. So there's a couple different ways you can guess. There's random guessing and educated guessing. Most of you know how to do educated guessing. It just involves eliminating the answer choices that you know are incorrect and narrowing it down from there. Doing this can tip the odds in your favor. So we also have random guessing, which I actually don't call random guessing. I wouldn't say it's random because I recommend my students guess all the same letter. This is when you don't have time to really read the questions. You have 1 minute left and you need to just guess. So you're going to guess all the same letter, and I recommend choosing a letter that you haven't chosen that much of before. Let's say you notice you have a lot of A's. You wouldn't guess A, you would guess one of the other letters. Okay, so it's important to know about how much time you will have per passage or per question. So the reading section, you will have 13 minutes per passage on average. The writing and language section, you will have about 9 minutes per passage. In the math with no calculator section, you will have 1 1/4 minutes per question. In the math with calculator section, you will have 1.5 minutes per question. The questions on the calculator section tend to be a little bit more difficult just because they require a little bit more time and multiple steps. They figure that you will have your calculator, so that will cause you to move more quickly on the test, but they therefore make the questions more difficult. Okay, so there is something that we call the two-pass approach. So on your first pass to each question, you decide whether you're going to do it now, do it later, or don't ever do it because you really don't think that you will ever understand it. So the questions that you do now, they're done, you don't have to worry about them. The do it later questions, you want to make sure that you circle those question numbers in your test booklet so that you know you have to go back and answer them. So the don't ever do it questions, you can leave till the end and guess all the same letter. Okay, so one other thing that I wanted to mention, let's say you're doing passage 1, right? If you go to passage 2, you probably, like the sections that have passages, like the reading section, you want to make sure that you're guessing at the end of each of the passages. So you don't want to move on to, you don't want to leave questions for later. Let's say you circle 2 and 4, right? So you come back at the end of the passage and you make sure to go back to those questions for the do it later. You don't want to move on to new passages because you will probably get boggled by the new passage information. If you go back at the end of the test, it'll be unlikely that you will be able to do the question more accurately at that point. Okay. Okay. So vocabulary on this test is in particular very important. So in order to help you understand what kind of words are going to show up on the test, we categorize the words into different tiers. So we have tier 1, which are basic words such as clock, child, happy, run. We have tier 2, words that are high frequency words by mature speakers. And those are words like brevity, coarse, outspoken. Some of them will be more familiar than others. Tier 3 are words that are not frequently used. Words like arcane, Byzantine, sardonic, heliotrope. So the words that you want to be the most concerned with studying for the test are going to be the tier 2 words. These are words that you may or may not know or heard of that are going to most often show up on the test. Okay. And at Score at the Top, we provide a list of tier 2 words that you should study in order to be appropriately exposed to the words that will show up on the test. You also want to be familiar with words with multiple meanings. Basically, words like mint can have 5 to 7 meanings. So for example, mint could be like the plant, right? So the leaf plant that goes, in food and drinks. And you can also have mints like the flavor, or a mint like a candy, or mint as in to make coins, or the mint as in where they make coins, things like that. Okay, so we'll switch over to reading section strategies now. So there are a few different types of passages that show up on the reading section. So you're going to have US and world literature type passages, and history and social studies type passages, science passages as well. So the US and world literature, you'll have 1 of each test. History and social studies, you'll have 2 of each test. And science, you will have 2 of each test. So when you see these, either the history and social studies or the science will have a paired passage out of the 4 of them. So paired passages we'll talk about it a little bit. They are two smaller passages that have something to do with each other that you will answer questions about comparing them and contrasting them and how one author might respond to the other author, things like that. Okay, so one of the most important strategies that we recommend is prioritizing your passages. So you want to do the passages that you're better at first. This way, if you end up leaving your most difficult passage towards the end and you run out of time, if you have to guess, then you might have not gotten those questions right anyway. So you want to get the most questions right in the least amount of time. We recommend doing the science passages first, then the history and social studies passages, then the literature passages. The reason why we recommend this is because science and history passages they're nonfiction passages, so they're usually more likely to say what they mean more directly and literally. Versus literature is more likely to have to be interpreted, so it can be a little bit more confusing. Okay. All right, so one type of question that you will see on the test is the information and ideas questions. So some of the questions that you will see will be careful reading questions, like what is stated or implied. Textual evidence, such as which part of the passage supports the answer to a previous question or a given conclusion. On those types of questions, I recommend reading through the options that they give you and then answering the question that came before. So if they say, how do you think the author would respond? How do you think the author of passage 2 would respond to the author of passage 1? I think that they would do this, 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 or this, right? So before you answer that actual question, there's a question that comes afterwards that says, where would you find the evidence for the previous question? You would read through the options that they give you and use those parts of the passage to answer the question that came before, because those parts of the passage are guaranteed to have the best evidence for that question. All right, and then we have questions like central ideas and themes. What's the main point or theme of a passage? Summarizing, can you recognize an effective summary? Understanding relationships, can you identify cause and effect, compare and contrast, or sequence regarding people, events, and ideas? Words in context, what is the precise meaning of a word or phrase as used in the passage? We also have rhetoric questions, and those will be questions that involve word choice. So why did they use a certain word in the passage? Text structure, in what way does the author shape or organize the writing so that the parts contribute to a whole? Point of view, how does the point affect form and content in the passage? Purpose, what is the author's claim in the whole passage or in part of it? Arguments, can you identify arguments and counter arguments along with the reasoning and evidence that the author brings to bear? Synthesis questions are for paired passages or informational graphics. So in paired passages, you want to make sure, do they agree or disagree? And in graphics, there will most likely be a question that says, pick the option that agrees with the passage and the graph. So you want to make sure that those two things agree. All right, let's see what we got here. So active reading strategies, you want to make sure you're visualizing what's taking place in the passage. Kind of keeps you from getting too bored. And then we also have read with your pencil, underlining key words, circling trigger words. I definitely recommend making brief notes in the margin to emphasize key points in the paragraph. That way, when you go back to answer the questions when you go back to answer the questions, you can go back to the passage and see where the most likely place the answer will be. That's the same thing as summarizing each paragraph by paraphrasing. So I really like this, be a detective, right? So you want to make sure that you can go back and find evidence for your answers in the passage. So an alternate reading strategy would be to read the questions first and then read the passage and then go back to the questions and answer them. So that's just a little overview of the reading strategies. So now we'll go ahead and do one of the passages that came up on the test. So the passages or questions that I'm going to show you may or may not have been the exact same order that you saw on your test. There were different versions of the test, and this is just one of them. So we have to go through and read this passage before we can answer any questions. So one thing that you'll notice is that it has a little summary up here stating what it's about, the surprising truth about moving others, right? And then you also have the time period in which it was written. So when you're prioritizing your passages, when you're figuring whether or not you should do this passage right now or maybe leave it till later, you're going to look at that time period and look at the general idea. So this is more of a social studies passage, right? Or maybe even a science passage. So this would be a passage that you would do first. As far as the time period, I would avoid passages that are the early 1900s or the late 1800s. They tend to use language that we no longer use today and tend to be more confusing. Okay, so bear with me while we go through and read this passage. As we go through, we'll do my favorite strategy, which is to write little notes in the margins about each of the paragraphs. So this starts out as: the notion that extroverts, people who are very outgoing and talkative, are the finest salespeople is so obvious that we've overlooked one teensy flaw. There's almost no evidence that it's actually true. So I would say no evidence, extroverts, extroverts, good salespeople. It doesn't have to make too much sense. It doesn't have to be a full sentence, just little notes that you know what this was talking about. Okay, so next paragraph. When social scientists have investigated the relationship between extroversion and sales success, they found the link, at best flimsy. For instance, while supervisors often gave extroverts high ratings, several researchers have found that extroversion has no statistically significant relationship with sales performance, and that extroversion is not related to sales volume. One of the most comprehensive investigations, a set of 3 meta-analyses of 35 separate studies involving 3,806 salespeople, found that the correlation between the extroversion and sales was essentially non-existent. And in parentheses, they say, positive correlations are measured on a scale that goes from 0 to 1, with higher numbers, say 0.62, indicating close correlations, and 0, no correlation at all. Across the 35 studies, the correlation between extroversion and sales performance was a minuscule 0.07. So I would say for this paragraph, study shows no correlation. So this is the actual evidence behind the claim that they made in the first paragraph. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Does this mean that introverts, those soft-spoken souls more at home in a study corral than at a party, are better at moving than others? Not at all. In fact, the evidence, which is emerging in new research, reveals something far more intriguing. So I would write introverts know better, question mark. The next paragraph, Adam Grant is a management professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and one of America's top young social psychologists. Some of his previous research had examined extroversion, and he'd become curious that a trait so widely associated with sales didn't have much connection to success in that realm. So he decided to find out why. So this is a new study, different from the one that was mentioned before. Then we have Grant collected data from a software company that operates call centers to sell its products. He began by asking more than 300 sales representatives to complete several personality assessments, including one that social scientists use to measure where people fall on the introversion-extroversion spectrum. This particular assessment lists statements such as, "I am the life of the party," and "I am quiet around strangers," and asks participants to rate themselves on a scale 1 to 7 scale, with their answers resulting in a numerical measure of extroversion. Then Grant tracked the sales representatives' revenues over the next 3 months. Perhaps not surprisingly, introverted sales reps didn't perform as well as extroverted ones, earning an average of $120 per hour in revenue compared with $125 per hour for their more outgoing colleagues. But neither did nearly as well as a third group, the ambiverts. Ambi what? So I would write ambiverts, better salespeople. These people, who are neither overly extroverted nor wildly introverted, go back to that 1 to 7 introversion-extroversion scale. Ambiverts sit roughly in the center. They're not 1s or 2s, and they're not 6 or 7s. In Grant's study, these Goldilocks personalities, not too hot, not too cold, earned an average of nearly $155 per hour, easily besting their counterparts. In fact, the salespeople who had the highest average revenue, $208 per hour, had extroversion scores between 4 and 4.5, smack at the midpoint. Okay. This note also applies here. These findings call into question the long-standing belief that most productive salespeople are extroverted, Grant writes. According to a large study of European and American customers, the most destructive behavior of salespeople wasn't being ill-informed. It was an excess of assertiveness and zeal that led to contacting customers too frequently. Extroverts, in other words, often stumble over themselves. They can talk too much and listen too little, which dulls their understanding of others' perspectives. They can fail to strike the proper balance between asserting and holding back, which can read as pushy and drive people away. So I would write why not extroverts? So they don't ever give you a reason why introverts are not good at selling, but they give you at the end here reasons why extroverts are not good at selling. All right, so let's head to the questions. And it looks like we have a graph associated with this passage. So what I would normally do is go ahead and read the graph as part of the passage. So the graph is titled Sales Revenue over 3-month period by degree of extroversion. We want to notice what we have on the y-axis and the x-axis. So on the y-axis, we have sales revenue over 3 months. And on the x-axis, we have the degree of extroversion, where 7 is the most extroverted. So you notice that sales increase when you reach the center of the scale here, and they decrease when you go towards the end as well. Towards either end, they decrease. All right, so number 10, The primary purpose of the passage is to A, propose a theory that accounts for a recent trend in a profession. We didn't really talk about a recent trend, right? It's something that has apparently been going on forever, but people have assumed that it was a particular way that extroverts were better as salespeople. So I wouldn't say it was a recent trend. B, present several hypotheses about the existence of a new personality type. So this isn't really about a new personality type, is it? It's recommending, it's not quite about that. It's a little bit different than what the center of the passage really is, the main idea of it. C, describe research that undermines a popular belief about a profession. I would say that's pretty much perfect. That pretty much describes what we just read. It, in particular, uses a lot of research evidence. It is undermining a popular belief, the belief that extroverts are better salespeople, and it's about a profession, sales. D, summarize findings that challenge a controversial study about a personality type. Well, the whole time they weren't talking about one particular personality type. And there wasn't a controversial study. They pretty much agreed with what they saw in the studies. Okay, so for 10, C would be the answer. 11 says, as used in line 2, finest most nearly means what? So let's go to line 2. On line 2, they say, so you might want to read the whole sentence here. The notion that extroverts, people who are very outgoing and talkative, are the finest salespeople. So finest salespeople. Let's plug in those answer choices. Can they be the purest salespeople, the subtlest salespeople, which means overly nice or not very noticeable? Can they be ableist salespeople or fanciest salespeople? So these type of salespeople, they're trying to imply that these salespeople are good at their jobs. So they're not necessarily the purest. They're not necessarily overly nice or underwhelming, and they're not necessarily fancy. So C is the best answer choice, where ableist means capable of. So that's definitely where your vocab comes in handy when you have words such as these where you're not really familiar with, that you can memorize, and hopefully if they come up, then you'll have a better idea of how to answer these questions. All right, let's do number 12. The parenthetical statements in lines 17 to 22, parenthetical meaning what falls inside of the parentheses, mainly serve to do what? So let's remind ourselves what they talked about here. It's kind of a lot, so we may not have to read the whole thing. They're talking about correlations and how they work. And so exactly how correlations work, right? In particular, positive correlations. So does that provide quantitative information to emphasize a finding presented earlier? It definitely provides quantitative information. Are we emphasizing a finding presented earlier? So beforehand, we were talking about a significant relationship and how we would describe that significant relationship. So yeah, I would say that's true. Let's double check the answer choices just to make sure. So B says, clarify why experts found a small positive correlation between sales performance and personality type. It's not really clarifying anything about that. It's just stating how to use the information. C, distinguish between the scale used for the 3 meta-analyses discussed earlier and the scale used in grant studies later. Well, correlation wasn't really used in grant study. Not that I remember, at least. D, explain how researchers compiled the data to calculate statistical values reported in the study. they weren't really talking about compiling the data, they were talking about interpreting the data. Okay, so in that case, I think that A is the best answer choice here. All right, so let's look at number 13. As used in line 25, moving most nearly means what? So let's go to 25. It says, does that mean that introverts are better at moving others? Moving others physically? No, moving others emotionally, right? So are they better at persuading others, advancing others, transporting others, or vacating others? It's going to be persuading, because salespeople always want to persuade people to buy something. All right, let's do number 14, and then we can move on to the writing and language strategies. This one says, the perspective adopted by the author in line 55 is best characterized as that of a... So on line 55, they say ambi what? So they introduce this random thing that you've never heard before, and then they go on to explain it. But I was kind of surprised when I read the passage that the author had this sort of tone. So that's why they're asking you, the perspective of the author is best characterized as that of A researcher who questions the validity of a finding. That doesn't seem right. B, general reader who is presented with an unfamiliar term. Absolutely. That was my exact response to the ambiverts vocab word or that unfamiliar term. So I would agree, a general reader who's presented with an unfamiliar term. C, social historian who investigates the origin of a technical term. They're not really investigating the origin of the term. They do go on to explain what it is, but that's not really what the author is doing there. D, scientist who formulates a hypothesis about a phenomena. No, that's pretty different from what's going on there. So B, I think, would be the best answer there. All right, so let's move on to writing and language strategies. Okay. So this test measures your knowledge of grammar and usage and punctuation in standard written English. Let's see. Pages here. All right. So you will have more questions on expression of ideas, which will ask you questions about the development, the organization, and the effective use of language in the passage. And you'll have a little bit less questions, but still about half, of standard English conventions, so where they're actually testing your knowledge of grammar rules. Okay. Okay. So this is a really good example. I love the strategy of noticing how the answer choices differ. So a lot of the times they will have answer choices that have multiple different things going on in them that they're changing in each one. So for this example, they say proof of the New Orleans chef's abilities were supremely demonstrated in their tasty gumbos. So in this case, their, her, and its are all different answer choices. So is it going to be their, her, or its? Well, let's look at who we're talking about. We're talking about the chef's abilities, right? This is telling us that the abilities belong to the chef, but it's just one singular chef. So it definitely won't be A or B. And if you would you normally respond, would you normally talk about a person as an its? No, so it can't be D either. So by that process of elimination, you will get C. People don't normally know what kind of tense of gumbo you will use, but D and A will always be wrong because you never refer to anything as gumbos. You can have one gumbo or multiple gumbo. So you never have an S at the end there, but just doing the other option gets you down to the best answer choice. All right. So one thing here is we're talking about redundancy. So the test hates redundancy. Redundancy. We don't like that, and an example of that is the bag was free, I didn't have to pay for it. That's two ways of saying the same thing. So you would not choose E. If you say the bag was free, I paid $5 for it, that's not necessarily redundant, but it's contradictory, so that doesn't work. The bag was free, I paid almost nothing for it. Well, it's still a little bit redundant, but also controversial. So, not controversial, contradictory to what was said earlier. So in that case, you would just go ahead and delete the thing that seems to be either repeating itself or contradictory information. Okay, so let's see. There will be other types of questions that we can talk about when we do the review of one of the passages, some of the practice passage, but one thing you should know in particular are grammar rules. So I won't go through all of them today, but you should definitely know them. Okay, my pen's not working. Give me 1 second. Okay, so let's see. We have grammar rules. So you should be able to pick apart sentences and identify what is an independent clause, what is a dependent clause, and how to use things like periods, semicolons, commas, dashes, parentheses. I'm trying to think of more things. How to use transitional adverbs, coordinating conjunctions. We don't have time to discuss all of those rules today, but if they do come up on the practice, I will mention how that works exactly. So I think that will be the next thing that we do, because here we start going into those actual grammar rules. So let's go over to our practice writing and language passage. Here we go. So the way that you're going to do these is you're going to read as you go, or read and answer the questions as you go. Sometimes you have to read a little bit above and a little bit below the question area that you have to make sure that you're getting all the information you need to answer the question. All right. So this passage is called The Detection of Gravitational Waves. Roughly 1 billion years ago and roughly 1 billion light years from Earth, two massive black holes spiraled inward and merged. In the early morning hours of September 14, 2015, evidence of the collision arrived on Earth in the form of gravitational waves. So, for number 12, it says, the writer is considering deleting the underlined portion and ending the sentence with just Earth. So they would just take this whole thing out of the sentence. Should it be kept or deleted? So my first instinct would be to keep it. It kind of introduces this new term. But let's see you can kind of use the explanations for the kept or deleted versions to decide whether these things are actually happening. So for A, it says kept because it introduces a key term in the passage, gravitational waves, which sets up the information that follows. So if you're not comfortable answering this question, if you feel like that might be it, you can kind of leave it until later on where you're seeing that, yes, we needed to introduce this term in order for it to set up the information. Okay. B says kept because it keeps the reader, it helps the reader understand the relationship between gravitational waves and gravity. Well, we weren't really talking about the relationship between the two things. I would say that's a no-go. C, deleted because it is redundant in combination with the rest of the information about gravitational waves in the passage. Okay, so maybe we want to leave that and check on that question later. Deleted, D for deleted because it mentions gravitational waves form, which is only loosely related at this point in the passage. It's not talking about the gravitational waves form. It's saying that the evidence arrived in the form of gravitational waves. So the evidence was the gravitational waves, not that it had some type of form. So it wouldn't be D. So it's up to you if you feel more comfortable waiting until later. But the answer is A. You would keep it because it introduces a key term, gravitational waves, which sets up the information that follows. All right, so let's keep reading. The detection of the waves, which travel at the speed of light, was the culmination of years of work, resulted in both excitement and a sense of validation among the researchers at the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO. This is the signal that we wanted to see from the beginning of this whole quest, said physicist Rainer Weiss, inventor of the measuring technique used by LIGO. Okay, so let's see what the punctuation is doing here. There's a rule that says if there's commas on either side of a phrase, then you can actually take this phrase out. So if we said physicist inventor of the measuring technique, we can't do that because we need to name who the inventor was in order to do that, so it won't be A. So if we only have the comma here, then it will be, there will also be this comma here, which says that we can remove this portion. So can we say, quote, Rainer Weiss, inventor? No, we have to say, said this person. So we need to leave that portion inside of the paragraph as well. All right. Then we have C, which says we will just put a comma here. Well, what that's doing is it's allowing this phrase to come in. It's saying, said this person, comma, restating who that person is. So you say Rainer Weiss, comma, inventor of the measuring technique used by LIGO. You have to use that comma there for that purpose, which is something that I summarize as comma restate. Because otherwise you would have to use different word choice, which the answer choices don't offer. If you said physicist Rainer Weiss, who was the inventor of the measuring, who is the inventor, you would need extra words in order for that to make sense. So C is the best possible answer choice there. Another reason why we wouldn't want a comma here. So something else you should know, whenever they have, like, in this case, they stated title and then the name of the person with that title, there will never be any punctuation separating them from each other, right? No punctuation. So you think that it would say physicist, comma, Rainer Weiss. No, they actually don't have anything like that. Or, for example, Kathy, biologist at this institute, there would be no punctuation separating the title and the name. Okay. Let's move on. Ooh. Okay. So this portion says, okay. Give me 1 second. This says, it also proves something Albert Einstein had hypothesized almost 100 years earlier. Okay, so the question says, Which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to the information that follows in this paragraph? So the previous paragraph was talking about so gravitational waves being detected, who sort of made that happen and why it was important, or that it was important. And then the next paragraph, we need to figure out what they're talking about there. So let's read a little bit. In 1916, thinking about the acceleration of massive objects through what he termed space-time. He, right? So who termed that? That was actually Albert Einstein. So we probably want to introduce Albert Einstein at some point. So A is looking like a pretty good option, but let's look at B. Weiss, a professor of physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was one of the three researchers to propose the LIGO project in the 1980s. Then it talks about in 1916 about terming space-time. Well, you kind of need to introduce Albert Einstein to start talking about space-time, so it's not about Weiss. C. Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity in 1915, and Arthur Eddington confirmed key aspects of his theory in 1919. And then in 1916, he was thinking about it. I don't know about that. That seems okay. That would maybe be our second best answer. D. LIGO continues to improve. It is expected in the near future to increase both its sensitivity and the volume of space it can survey. Well, we still need to introduce this guy, Albert Einstein. So do we like, it also proves something Albert Einstein had hypothesized almost 100 years earlier? I think that's the best one because it leads from the last paragraph talking about the discovery of gravitational waves and into this next paragraph where they're talking about what he hypothesized 100 years earlier, which was this thing called space-time. Okay, so let's reread that little piece so we can answer 15. In 1916, thinking about the acceleration of massive objects through what he termed space-time, the so-called fabric of the universe, combining the three dimensions of space with time, Einstein's conclusion was that the object's motion would create ripples or waves in space-time. So this next question is asking us, what's the best way to do this? So are we going to say Einstein's conclusion was that the object's motion would create ripples? Or would we say Einstein concluded that the motion of the objects would create ripples? Would we say the object's motion concluded Einstein would create ripples? Would we say the motion of the objects Einstein concluded would create ripples? So they all are getting the same idea across, but these are very chunky and crazy. And another reason why you don't want to choose those, whenever you mention something and you want to say somebody did something involved with the previous phrase, you would use this thing that I call comma noun. You want to introduce the noun as soon as you hit that comma right here, to make sure that it's clear who you're talking about. So that's another reason why I wouldn't choose C or D. So, do we want to say Einstein's conclusion was that the object's motion, or Einstein concluded that the motion of the objects? B is the best way to say that. It's clear and concise. All right, let's move on to number 16. So next it says, unfortunately, the gravitational waves Einstein predicted were so faint and he feared they would never be detected. So you need to make sure that your, sorry, my pen is not working today. Need a new battery. So you want to make sure that there's this cause and effect relationship here. It was faint, so he feared that they would never be detected. All right. So which object portrays that in the best way? Would we say, unfortunately, the gravitational waves Einstein predicted were so faint and he feared? the gravitational waves Einstein predicted were faint, and so he feared. The gravitational waves Einstein predicted were so faint that he feared. Or the gravitational waves Einstein predicted were faint so that he feared. So the best way to do this is going to be C, because it establishes this relationship that's very clear. It says that the gravitational waves were so faint that he feared they would never be detected. All right, let's move on to 17. Let me see. Okay, let's see how we get through these next couple questions. In a few minutes here, we'll move on to some math. Okay, so we have by 2015, the twin facilities of LIGO have achieved a level of sensitivity that would allow Einstein's ideas about gravitational waves to be tested empirically. So we were just talking about how Einstein thought that they would never be detected, and then we're saying that they were. So this is a contrast. So we want to make sure that we're using something that contrasts. So however, definitely shows contrast, right? Moreover, expands on or continues what we were just talking about. And therefore is more like a because, it's establishing a result relationship, then establishes some kind of chronological relationship here. Chronological, okay. So the best option here would be A, because we're changing from the idea of it not being able to be observed to the idea that it actually has been. Okay, so number 18, the twin facilities of LIGO have achieved a level of sensitivity. Sorry. Are we going to say the twin facilities of LIGO will achieve a level of sensitivity? The twin facilities of LIGO would have achieved a level of sensitivity, or that they had achieved a level of sensitivity? So by 2015 is mentioning it in the past. So this is not something that will occur in the present like B. And so B is in the present and C is conditional. It would have achieved if this occurred. So neither of those are relevant. And then we also have the twin facilities of LIGO have achieved. They have done it. That case does not work directly with, okay, so I have is present. Or sorry, will is actually future. Sorry about that. Will achieve something in the future, and then this have is present, and this one is past. So you want to say that this occurred in the past. By this year in the past, they had achieved a level of sensitivity that would allow his gravitational waves to be tested. Okay, let's keep going. Each of these two L-shaped observatories, one located in Louisiana and one in Washington State, consists of two 2.5-mile long tubes set at a 90-degree angle. Laser beams travel down each tube through a nearly perfect vacuum are reflected by mirrors to detectors. So I can already tell that that one is not good. You're saying laser beams travel down each tube through a nearly perfect vacuum are reflected? No. Would you say laser beams travel down each tube through a nearly perfect vacuum being reflected? No. Also, this is sort of a present tense situation, so you wouldn't want to talk about the past they traveled down or reflected, in the past, right? So C says laser beams travel down each tube through a nearly perfect vacuum, comma, they are. So this one is a perfect example of where we can use our grammar rules. So if you say laser beams travel down each tube through a nearly perfect vacuum, that is an independent clause. That's a full sentence. Well, if we do comma here, they are reflected by mirrors to detectors where tubes meet is also an independent clause. That would mean that we're combining two independent clauses with a comma, which is unacceptable. So it can't be C either. So what about D? It says laser beams travel down each tube through a nearly perfect vacuum and are reflected by mirrors to detectors. It's saying these two things happen. All right, let's do the next one. The detectors are extremely sensitive. The detectors can tell if a gravitational wave has compressed or stretched the distance to either mirror or by just 1/10,000th the width of a proton. So 20 says, which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlying portion? Well, we can take note of what they've done before. So before it was independent clause, period, independent clause, period. Okay. Well, if we change out this and say for A, it will sound like this. The detectors are extremely sensitive because they can tell if a gravitational wave has compressed or stretched the distance to either mirror. Because they're sensitive because they can tell. Hold on. I'm not sure exactly what's going on with that one. Let's try B. The detectors are extremely sensitive, comma, in addition to being able to. Okay, that grammar is all messed up. So we would have an independent clause to begin with, then a comma, then in addition to being able to. That's just awful. This is really awful. In addition to being able to tell. Yeah, instead you would end the sentence and then do in addition, comma, another sentence period. You can use it as a transition, but in this case, this is just all kinds of messed up grammar. Okay, so C says, the detectors are extremely sensitive, colon, they can tell if a gravitational wave, blah, blah, blah. So this is the best option because you have this independent clause, which is required when you use a colon. Then you explain what they mean by they are sensitive, which is totally valid way to use a colon. And it's the best way to introduce the information. All right. So we have just two more questions here, and then we will move on to the math. I wanted to get to another informational graphic question. So for 21, it says, on that September morning, researchers at both facilities observed a series of gravitational waves that rapidly increased in intensity until they peaked at about 250 milliseconds after they began. So what's the most accurate interpretation of data in the graph? Well, they want us to choose where the peak was. So where did the graph peak? Well, the peak is the highest point, right? And we're looking at milliseconds. Hold on. If we're looking at milliseconds, then we would look on this axis, the x-axis. So where does this occur? Okay, well, this is at about 400, this is about 450, so it's not 400 or 450, and it's not 250 all the way over here. So it's got to be 425, right in the middle of 400 and 450, like it shows on the graph. Okay, so then they say, these observations are consistent with the scenario of two black holes merging. Okay, let's make this a little smaller. LIGO physicists spent a month discrediting every possible alternate explanation for their observation. Well, they don't want to discredit their observation. They don't want to disregard their observation. They don't want to call out their observation. That's a little informal as well. We don't want to use, this is more of a formal passage. But they do want to rule out alternate explanations for their observation to make sure that what they observed was from the black holes merging and not just some random occurrence. All right, so now we'll move on to math strategies. So the math section is going to test the skills that you would have acquired in your first 2 to 3 years of high school. So classes like Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2 are essential for, let's say, the SAT. The PSAT doesn't have as difficult, let's say, more Algebra 1 and Geometry questions than just, than also Algebra 2 for the SAT. So most of the test is actually going to be testing algebra, but you will have a few geometry questions throughout. All right, let's see. Oh, so the first math section actually does not permit a calculator use. So you have to be able to do some of these calculations in your head or by hand. They're usually not extensive calculations, and they're not really difficult calculations. If you have your multiplication tables memorized and other math facts, then you should be fine. The second math section, section 4, does allow calculator use. Like I said earlier, these questions tend to actually involve questions that have extensive sort of arithmetic and more multiple step problems. Okay. One other thing you might want to observe. So generally, the section 3 math section, it's going to have multiple choice and grid-ins. And from multiple choice in the beginning, it will start off easy and get harder, generally. Same thing for the grid-ins. The grid-ins will start off easy and then get to hard. And the same thing for section 4. Ooh, whoops. So you have varying levels of difficulty throughout the test. So like I said, I recommend doing the grid-ins first, even if you want to skip the hard ones towards the end and go to the multiple choice. But these are the ones that you really can't guess on. So that's how I recommend doing those questions. All right, so this is a little bit of a summary of what will be covered on, for example, the SAT math. Things like linear equations and quadratics and ratios and proportions, all of those things will show up on PSAT. Oh, yes, so that's this one. It just doesn't include as much higher level math. So we have a list of particular math ideas and concepts that you should probably know for the test. And you should know that you do get a math formula sheet for each section. So these are all of the formulas that actually show up on the test. So they give you the area and circumference of a circle, the area of a rectangle, stuff like that. You really should know everything except for maybe these. Special right triangles, you can always figure out using trigonometry, but you learn them in geometry and they can help you do questions quicker. So if you memorize those, that will help. And any of these volume questions, you can always go back to the front of that section and find it. But it's recommended that you actually memorize all of the formulas that you don't know. That way you don't have to waste time flipping back to them. All right. using a calculator. So what kind of calculator should you use? You should either use a graphing or a scientific calculator. You should, at the end of the day, you should use whatever calculator you're most comfortable with. Let's say that you switch calculators. You want to make sure you have ample time to get practice with that calculator. If your calculator needs to be charged, make sure you charge it the night before the test. Okay, so general math tips. Memorize the formulas at the beginning of each math section. Use blank space in your test booklet to draw pictures and calculate. Don't work in your head, write everything down. Write neatly so you can read your own handwriting. Read a math question in chunks. I especially like this one, especially when you have word problems. You can make sure that you are covering each little part of the math problem without getting overwhelmed. Watch for conversions like hours to minutes and feet to inches. They're usually underlined or capitalized, so they're really supposed to be obvious, but sometimes we miss them anyway. It can be helpful to approximate. So if you can know that square root of 8 falls between 3 and 2, but it's closer to 3. Oh, wait, yes. And then we also have a couple strategies like plugging in numbers for the unknowns. So if we have certain types of problems, it will be helpful to plug in some numbers to see if the way that this question is behaving will be the same as what we need for the answer choice. We also have substitute the answer choices or working backwards. So that means that you're just going to substitute the answer choices into the problem to test them out to see if they're correct. Or check the answer choices for hints such as square root or pi to make sure that you don't oversimplify the problem. Also use process of elimination to take an educated guess. All right, so let's move on to some sample math problems. So we'll do the math with no calculator section first. Okay, so the first problem that we'll do is number 4. So this one says if 2 times x minus 5 plus 3 times x minus 5 is equal to 10, what is the value of x minus 5? I just realized that there's an alternate way to do this, but my first instinct, first you want to write down the problem exactly as you see it to get started. 2 times x minus 5 plus 3 times x minus 5 equals 10. So the first thing that I would do would be to distribute these numbers. It would be 2 on those and 3 on these. So that would be 2 times x is 2x. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, plus 3 times x is 3x. 3 times negative 5 is negative 15, equals 10. Then we're going to combine our like terms. So 2x plus 3x is 5x. Then negative 10 minus 15 is negative 25, equals 10. Then we're going to add 25 to either side. So we will get 5x equals 30. We'll divide by 35. We'll divide by 5 and get x equals 7. Okay, maybe x equals 7. No. The question said, what is the value of x minus 5? So x minus 5 is equal to what? 7. We found that x is 7, so 7 minus 5 equals 2. And that's the correct answer. All right, so let's do number 6. I'll give you a second to write that down if you're working on that. All right, so number 6 is actually a geometry problem. I thought this one was a little bit interesting. So it says, in the xy plane shown, square ABCD, which is the square there, has diagonals on the x, y, and y axes. What is the area in square units of the square? So we want to know what the area is. So we know the area of a square is equal to length times width. Or you can just say, well, the length and the width are the same, so we can do something like the side squared. In that case, because it's a square, you only need to find one of the sides. So in order to find the length of the side, we need to find the distance between these 2 points. So you'll need the distance formula. This formula comes up way more than you would expect it to. Make sure you have it memorized. It's nowhere on the formula sheet or anything, so if you don't know it, then you'll just get this question wrong. All right, so we'll label this point our x1 and x2, sorry, y2. This is our point 1. So in this point, it will be 5, 0. And on this point will be our second point. Which is 0, 5. So this is our x1, y1, and our x2, y2. So let's plug those in. Our x2 is 0, minus x1 is 5. y2 is, oh, this pen, it's so dead. Okay, there we go. y2 is 5 minus y1 is 0 squared. This is all under the square root. So that's square root of negative 5 squared plus 5 squared. So that will be square root of 25 plus 25. So that's the square root of 50. All right, so that's the length of one of the sides, right? Or we'll say S. So if we want to find the area, we know we can do square root 50 squared. So that means the area is just 50. All right, let's move on to another problem. I'll give you another minute to write that down. Okay, so the next problem I set aside was this problem. So which expression is equivalent to this? All right, so if we have square root of 16x to the 16th power, we can use a rule that says we can separate it. Square root 16 times square root x to the 16th power. Well, if you know your root rules, the square root of 16 is 4. So that means C and D are out. Okay, well, if you know your root rules for this, you know that you can take out pairs of pairs of x's. So in this case, there are 8 pairs of x's. For example, we can write it like this. X squared times x squared times x squared times x squared 8 times, right? So, and you can separate them to be square root of x squared times square root of x squared times square root of x squared 8 times. In that case, we would get 8 x's. So that would be B. Okay, so the next problem is going to be 13. So we have this system of equations. A solution to the given system of equations is x equals y. Which of the following is a possible value of x times y? So they almost always ask you for something that isn't initially what you would think it would be. Oh, solve for x, or solve for y, or solve for the point x, y, right? Which means you would have to solve for both. No, they don't want you to do that. They want you to solve for x times y. So what I would do for this problem, we have x squared. Okay, so x squared equals 3x plus y. So in that case, we would get x squared equals, minus 6x equals y. That's if we solve for y. So it's another way of, and then we also have this y, y equals negative 6x plus 36. So because these are both equal to y, we can actually set them equal. So x squared minus 6x equals negative 6x plus 36. Okay, and then if we add 6x on both sides, we get x squared equals 36. If we want to cancel the squared, we will square root it, and we get x equals 6. Okay, pick 6. No, we can't do that, right? Because that's not what they're asking us for. So now we actually need to find y. So this equation would probably be the easiest to find y. So we're going to plug in 6 for x. Y equals negative 6 times 6 plus 36. Y equals negative 36 plus 36. Okay, so y equals 0. Now we're going to do x times y. Okay, well, 6 times 0 is just 0. So the answer is 0. Okay, now let's do number 17, one of the grid ends on this section. Number 17 says, if 1 over x plus 1 over 3x equals 5, what's the value of 3x over 4? So my first instinct is I want to combine these two fractions. So let's go ahead and make that happen. So in order to do that, we need to find a common denominator, and that can just be 3x. So we'll multiply that one by 3 over 3 to get 3 over 3x plus 1 over 3x equals 5. Okay, so now we have to add the top and keep the bottom the same. So 4 over 3x equals 5. Okay, well that's really close to what they were asking for. What if we just flip it? So that means 3x over 4 is equal to 1 over 5. And that's the final answer. That value is equal to 1 over 5. For these types of questions, you always want to just start doing some math and try to get what it looks like. Try to get your work similar to what it looks like. But you shouldn't try to figure it out in your head. Just start doing some math on the page. All right. So let's move on to the math with calculator section. We have number 3. During a sale, the original price of all items in a clothing store have been reduced by 20%. What is the sale price of a jacket with an original price of $50? So if we have a $50 jacket, there's 2 ways to approach this. You can find the amount of money that they take off because of the 20% sale. Hello? All right. Looks like my pen might have actually died this time. Give me one moment. Let's try this one more time. Normally I have a replacement battery with me, but not today. All right, so that looks good. So let's do this problem. We have 50. Oh, no. I think it's about done. Yeah. So it looks like my pen is at the end of its rope today. So with only a couple minutes left, we'll have to end it here. Hopefully you were all able to see some of the strategies that we think are most important for the PSAT or SAT. And you were able to go over some of the questions that you might have gotten wrong on the PSAT in October. You were able to see how to approach some of these reading, writing and language, and math questions. So if you would like to come see me for test prep, remember my name is Sarah and I'm at the Boca location for Score at the Top. I will be here and can't wait to meet you. All right, this is Sarah signing off.